So today we're talking to Jan Winhall. She's a focusing-oriented psychotherapist in Toronto, and we're going to be talking to her about her unique approach to addiction. We're so happy to have you here. And we are asking some of our presenters if they have a quote that means something to them in their work, or something they found, or something inspiring. Do you have one?
I sure do. It's a quote by Jean Gendlin, who is the founder of Focusing. I want to start with the most important thing I have to say. The essence of working with another person is to be present as a living being. And this is lucky, because if we had to be smart or good or mature or wise, then we would probably be in trouble. But what matters is not that. What matters is to be a human being with another human being, to recognize the other person as another being in there. Even if it's a cat or a bird, if you're trying to help a wounded bird, the first thing you have to know is that there is somebody in there, and that you have to wait for that person, that being in there, to be in contact with you. That seems to me to be the most important thing.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, Jean.
Jean Gendlin. And I think it speaks to the idea that what is deep inside of us, in what he calls the felt sense, is not on the tip of our tongues, that it takes time and attention and care to have that emerge.
And it takes another being to be with you, to see that, to nourish it, be able to be present with it. And that's the problem in addiction, is that in so many ways, we aren't giving that to each other.
Yes.
And really being there and listening to what is going on for the person who's struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the most important thing, beyond any of the other theories and all that stuff.
Yeah, it's just a human being.
Yeah.
With another human being.
Yeah.
So you're a focusing-oriented psychotherapist. How does that differ from a different kind of psychotherapist?
Well, focusing is a contemplative practice. It's a way of working in the body with emotion. So a little different than meditation, because in focusing, we really bring in and invite the emotional and the physical parts of an experience, and work with those in an embodied kind of way in trauma and in other ways as well. So it's different, I suppose, in that sense, that it's embodied.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how long have you been working in the field of addiction?
A long time, really, since I started practicing. So that's like, it's about 40 years ago. Really.
Okay.
40 years ago, yeah.
That's a long time. So, yeah. And did you come into it with this approach, or how has your approach changed?
My approach that I've created, this model, has really come from starting in the very beginning of doing the work, and just thinking about what I'm doing and how is the best way to be with all of the kind of struggle that people who are challenged with addiction are experiencing. And so over the years, I've really just started to integrate different models and develop my own way of working, like lots of us do.
Mm-hmm. So can you say a little bit more about what that looks like with an individual?
So maybe if I say how I started, I was a young social worker. I was working in a hospital, general hospital, but in the psychiatric mental health unit. So we did inpatient and outpatient work, and I was running groups for incest survivors, for young women mostly. So lots of struggling around regulating emotionally. And the way that was understood in the context that I was working in at the hospital was through this medical model, and that there was a diagnosis that went with this, which was often borderline personality disorder. And the ways in which people were managing their emotions, as I saw it, were being conceptualized as really kind of like acts of suicidal ideation or expression, and a kind of almost masochistic way of being with oneself. But when I really listened to what women were saying in the group, it wasn't so much that at all for many women. It was about trying to regulate their emotions.
Mm.
And so that's really the home of my work, is understanding self-soothing behaviors as ways of trying to regulate oneself inside. And in the back then, we talked about that, particularly the feminist therapists were talking about that in terms of numbing and flooding. And so now I've become much more interested in, not more interested, but interested in like Siegel's work in interpersonal neurobiology, and he talks about it in terms of chaos and rigidity. So sort of layering different conceptualizations of how to understand this struggle, and then really seeing in many ways the whole range of so-called DSM diagnoses as falling along that continuum of flooding to numbing.
Hmm. So, and I think you're saying, I'd like you to say more about flooding and numbing, but I'm assuming when you're saying numbing, you're saying that people are using substances to numb.
Yeah.
And that the practices that you use teach a different way of self-soothing.
Yes, through grounding.
Through
So
grounding.
I'm a very visual person, I discovered over the years, and I have created this visual model of what, how we work with this. And I want to show it to you. I won't keep it up. So basically what we're looking at here in my model, this is numbing or dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
Down in this place of divided and dissociated aspects of experience. This is the grounded place. And this is chaos or flooding. Cycle here is the cycle of addiction. So understanding that what people are doing is often shifting the felt sense, we would say in focusing, or shifting regulation from chaos down to numbing and rigidity to be able to cope. What we teach is helping people to move down here when you're in chaos or in rigidity, and practices in focusing, for example, and other things that help people to build this place in their bodies. So that, and in focusing, we don't really talk, we don't use the word addiction. We talk about process skipping.
Ah, okay.
So Jean
What's
Gendlin,
that?
yeah, coined this term. And Gendlin was the founder of focusing, which he discovered through doing research with clients and therapists who both reported positive outcomes. So people who were making changes in the process of therapy. And so he described this thing he called process skipping, the idea being that people are skipping over processes that need to really be experienced because they're too uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And that was his way of talking about addiction.
Ah, so for example, we might say trauma, like not wanting to re-experience the trauma, and so you build up resistance to that or defenses against that. He would call that process skipping, and that your method helps people drop in somehow to experience that and resolve it and be able to self-soothe through that.
Yes, with lots of emphasis on grounding in the body, getting the right amount of distance and closeness. So working with this flooding and numbing dimension and getting the right amount of distance and closeness from all of that is so uncomfortable. And learning practices that are not, they're not explicit necessarily. When we focus, we close our eyes, down inside into the body, and helping people to learn how to expand that window of tolerance inside so that they can be with those feelings.
Okay. So can you work with somebody while they're, well, first let's talk about being flooded. What does that mean exactly?
Flooding is hypervigilance. It's that state of arousal of flight fight when people are, the amygdala, the emotion part of the brain is firing off, and people are in a triggered state, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's learning how to manage those triggers.
Okay. And so do you try to re-trigger that when you're working with somebody and then teach the self-regulation, or are you teaching self-regulation skills first? And
We always start with as much as we can do that the person's able to start with self-regulation skills. So we start with the practice of focusing, learning how to slowly touch in and go down. And then, of course, as you do that, feeling starts to come, right? Experience starts to come. So we teach how to, if we see the person starting to flood, go over to the other end, then we come back to that grounded place. And we do a lot of our work. I run a center, a focusing center and a training center in therapy. And so most of the work that I do with people with addiction eventually is in groups.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because that's what it's all about, right? It's about, addiction is about isolation. So we're working on bringing people in to relationship with each other and developing what we call focusing partnerships. So you're at the same time that you're learning about yourself inside, you're also listening to another person. And this is I do this very carefully because, of course, we don't want to re-traumatize people. That's not what it's about. It's about first grounding and helping people, of course, always to feel safe. But slowly, then the experience starts to come forward as people feel accepted and not shamed in the groups.
So you're saying that they're doing focusing in pairs with each other. So they're learning how to guide somebody in focusing.
Yeah. So this is like so rich because you're coming, and often I find that people that are struggling with addictive stuff, they when they want relationship or they want connection, they want it to really be meaningful. And so it's a very powerful way of being able to teach that with clients, and that it creates this enormous sense of healing shame and having meaning to what you're experiencing right now in the present moment. Moving us right away. My model is non-pathological. It's all a strength-based model. I really like Mark Lewis's work on understanding addiction as a developmental process and a learning process. And we reframe it a lot in our groups.
So you're not just teaching social skills to get them not to isolate. They're actually going very deep with each other.
Very deep with each other, with me there and other students that are learning. So it's very, very safe in that work, but it's very deep. Yeah. Getting into those shame places and the places of isolation. When you experience that with other people that are struggling with it too, it's why I do the work, because it's easy. Yeah.
So and then I guess they form attachments. I know you talked about attachment. So they're forming attachment with each other as they do that. And
yeah. And I've started introducing more of the actual neurobiology piece, like understanding, some of the work that's been done in the research on meditation, and kind of, hypothesizing that there are things that we're doing in the focusing practice that are similar to meditation. And then looking at what areas of the brain that activates in this grounded place, this middle prefrontal cortex, and teaching this to people. And some people aren't that interested, but many people are fascinated by it. And the very helpful way for a lot of people to understand that what we're doing when we're grounding and we're feeling into these implicit unconscious places in the body, and we're sharing that together with people who care about us and we feel safe with, is all part of building, I think. I mean, we sure need more research in focusing this middle prefrontal cortex area of the brain, which is about attunement and secure attachment. Also, you know, Siegel's work.
Mm-hmm.
Very
So, yeah, empathy.
empathy building, morality, bodily regulation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So this part of the brain is connected to all three of the sort of, you know, parts of the brain, the emotional part of the brain and the brain stem and the cortex. So helping people to really imagine that when we're actually doing the work, how healing that can be. And the other thing that's really interesting that occurred to me is like this area of the brain is right here, which is in the Eastern world, they call the third eye.
Mm.
So I started exploring about the third eye, and people love this.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know, right, what we're doing,
Yeah.
how it works
Mm-hmm.
in the context of what we call in our center a safe nest, place where
Right.
we, yeah, can really be together. And what's really becoming exciting is that as people are growing to know each other better, in some of the groups that aren't addiction or process skipping focused, people are just sharing, oh, you know, well, I'm an addict and I struggle with this or that. And I love that what's happening is that now we can have groups where we work on, say, process skipping. Everybody process skips.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody does. So it kind of normalizes, for lack of a better word, what we all can struggle with in some way or another.
Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of degree, I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah. So can you say a little bit more about the process of focusing itself? Like what is actually being done in these dyads, or what are you teaching them?
Yeah. Well, Gene, he noticed these quiet pause moments, he called them, when he was recording these sessions with clients and therapists. And when he asked them, like, what are you doing in those quiet moments? He discovered through really listening that what people were doing was what he really then named and broke down into 6 steps in a focusing practice. So that we could teach it to people, because it seems like, you know, some people just know focusing. For me, focusing is a state of integration. And some people are there. They haven't lost it. They haven't somehow or other, however life has unfolded. And for other folks, maybe because they've become really dysregulated emotionally, who knows, but they can't connect, right? It's too scary, it's too overwhelming, or it's too numbing. So Gene said, well, let's see if we break it down into steps, then we can teach it to people. And that's what we do. So the first step in focusing is a lot like meditation, clearing space. It really is it's a meditative process. David Rome in our community wrote a book called Mindful Focusing. He's a meditator where he's integrated meditation practice with focusing practice. And the first step goes together very nicely. He calls it grounded, aware presence. It's beautiful. So the first step is clearing space in whatever, we have different ways of doing that. But basically you're taking what's coming between you and feeling uncomfortable and you're moving it out. You're getting the right distance from it. So right there in step 1, we're teaching a grounding, self-regulating exercise. And we use that and we go back to that over and over again to develop a new neural pathway. Yeah. And we just keep coming back to it. And we have different ways of doing it. We do David Rome's way. Sometimes we do this traditional way. Sometimes the next step in focusing, when we feel safe enough to go down turn attention down into the body, is called finding the felt sense. And that's about connecting with this kind of murky, deeper response to what's happening in our lives.
Okay, so it's not a feeling?
No, it contains a feeling. The way I teach it is that the felt sense contains feelings and thoughts and physical sensation. How does the body carry it? And also memories.
Mm.
I use that a lot because of working so much in trauma. And then when you can go to that memory part of it, and I ask people to give me some information when you're down in there about each of those different kind of avenues into this whole experience. And often that's where you see triggers coming through the memory part, you know, and something will happen in the body, a tightness, an intensity. Yeah. And
And so that stays, those body sensations from the past kind of stay put until you are able to process that which you have skipped previously.
Yes, exactly. That which you have skipped, either because it's too traumatic, and so you know the hippocampus is just shut down and blocked because it was traumatic, and you know it didn't get processed properly. So that's what we want to be able to bring enough of in a safe way to reprocess, or just because some people process skip for other reasons, you know, and so it may not be that deep a state. Then in step 3, we get what we call a handle for that experience of something that's kind of core in there in the body. And the handle is a very important way of naming what's happening in there, which we know is a powerful thing in the brain when we name something. And also we think maybe that this also has to do with a shift that we look for in focusing. So the shift happens when some new information comes from the implicit, from the body. Yeah. And then in step 4, we resonate with that handle place. So we want to stay there. And you can see that all along the way through these 6 steps, people are learning how to regulate, how to self-regulate, how to stay there or back up a little bit, because you might want to, then when we go to step 5 of asking into this felt sense and this process, is it okay to stay there? Do you need to back up a little bit? Can I come in there with you? Do we need to sort of put this thing in a balloon and float it away? Or people find many, many ways to find that right closeness and distance to just keep working with that window of tolerance. Yeah. And then step 6 is a kind of a welcoming of what came. And in focusing, it shares, you know, like so many contemplative practices, this way of being with something we call the focusing attitude of acceptance and welcoming however uncomfortable, whatever came is, because all of it gives us information about how we're living our lives.
Thank you for that clear explanation of the process. You mentioned something about information coming from the implicit.
Yes.
And so, I think this kind of gets into how focusing relates to change. How does focusing bring about change? Can you talk a little about that?
Well, the change comes deeply down into the body, right? Into that implicit world. So if we just stay up in our cortex, we're probably not, and certainly we're not always going to be able to get the help we need to make the changes. That so much of what happens, particularly in trauma and addiction, is that the damage or the wound is down in this emotional part of the brain and in the bodily reptilian part of the brain. So we need to be able to find these pathways down into the body to be able to really affect profound change. And that's where, you know, it's really such an exciting time now in our work, because we've got these fMRIs and PET scans to be able to see more about what is actually going on in the brain. And to understand that we can't just stay up in this cognitive place, because once we're really stressed, that prefrontal cortex gets all shaky and we're responding through the flight, fight, freeze end of that emotional spectrum. So we have to find ways of kind of going deeper than that, down into the implicit, the dream world, the unconscious world, the body world. Yeah. to really affect the change. And that's a huge thing because, you know, CBT has really taken over, and
Yes.
in a way that I think is just, I mean, there's nothing wrong with CBT, but now you see too, which is great. I mean, people are combining it with a more of a kind of mindfulness practice. I think we have to combine it with more of a body-based psychotherapy practice to really
Hmm.
trauma.
So cognitive behavioral therapy, meaning CBT,
Yeah.
that's the predominant model that is taught and practiced, you're saying? And that,
I think it is a predominant model for sure.
mhm,
You know, it's part of mainstream treatment, right? It's,
mhm, yeah.
and
And
it,
so that doesn't get so much to the body sense, and where the the material is actually stored in the emotional brain and in the body.
yes, yeah. I think there's more of a growing awareness of that now, but it's still really lagging a lot,
Mm-hmm.
a lot, like, like shockingly a lot, how people will hold on to old information, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in the addiction world, it's like, I'm so glad you're doing this summit because we badly need new models for treating addiction. Badly, badly. I think it would be wonderful post summit to have an actual conference where we're live together and
Mm-hmm.
sharing each other's models and creating this new umbrella for radical recovery and recovery that is not pathologizing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's incredibly destructive and disrespectful,
Yeah.
really disrespectful and ignorant. It's just not helpful at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, and once someone gets an identity as an addict, I've seen research that really is a thing that leads to relapse.
yeah, because it feels shaming.
Well, and that their identity is that I'm an addict, so I might as well use if I'm an addict.
Yeah, yeah, it feels
Yeah.
hopeless. And in actual fact, I was just listening to a podcast with Mark Lewis, and he writes about this in his book too, The Biology of Desire, that, you know, in most cases, addiction, people do recover.
Mm.
It's a study that was done with 20,000 people, and I was just listening, so I didn't get down the exact, but I'm going to go back and hear it again. And he talks about how most people do recover from addiction, and most people recover without treatment.
Hmm.
So what does that tell us?
Wow.
Fascinating.
I hadn't heard that. I wonder how what's where he's finding the
I'll send it to you.
data.
I'll listen,
Okay.
I'll send it to you because I think it's a stunning finding.
It is.
And you know, he's got a very interesting mind.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So what have you seen, what changes have you seen over the 40 years that you've been in this in terms of addiction, substances that people are addicted to, rates of addiction?
I think one of the things I've seen is that the old sort of model was really one that was just about treating sobriety, establishing sobriety, and that most of the treatment around that was around was with AA and NA, and all of those different groups that took off as a result of AA. And now I think there is, you know, so the trauma people were very separate from the addiction people. And there was a split there, I think, with sort of the trauma people, addiction people would tell me we were called book people, and they were called, you know, the real thing. And I think now one of the things that is happening more and more is that there is an awareness that the first step, the first stage in addiction treatment is this establishing sobriety stage for sure. And, you know, AA does an okay job with that for people that it works with. It doesn't work for a lot of people, and that's a big problem. But then now there's much more of awareness that we have to do the trauma work, which is often underneath and the second kind of phase of the treatment. And I think we're beginning to talk more together, each of those different bodies with each other about how to do that and when to do that. And I'm doing that more with clients that they might start off, they go to for, you know, say a month away or a couple of weeks away, and then they come back and they have kind of like an accountability coach or counselor who's connected with them for the first little while. And then when they both feel like they've got a bit of a handle on it and they're not white knuckling, they move on to the trauma piece. And I think that's relatively new and it's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there's also just more awareness of the growing, probably growing rates of addiction. I mean, who knows? Back then, it's hard to know what we know now and how it related to back then, given who, you know, how did we do that research back then? But it certainly seems to be something that's growing like crazy in our culture, particularly with the advent of the internet. I do a lot of sex addiction work, and there's no question that the internet is like a turbo engine for sex addiction. With young people, really, it's a serious concern. So I think those ways it's really growing, and just internet addiction, like it's a problem.
Yes.
Culture like crazy.
And do you see the same correlation between trauma and sex addiction, or trauma and internet addiction, or porn addiction?
You mean that the person has a history of trauma?
Yeah. You know, like
addiction, it seems to be yes, that in certain populations, like if you read Patrick Cairns' work, he'll say the studies that he does, there's like, you know, over 90% of sex addicts have a history of sexual abuse. And yet, I mean, I think we have to really be careful there, very careful about all of this stuff, really, because I think it depends on the age you're studying as well. If you're looking at like 15-year-olds, maybe that's not true anymore. We live in a different world now than a 50-year-old, you know? So we have to be so careful of that, I think. And always linking it to attachment, and then always blaming mothers and this stuff that is just, it can be highly problematic if we just try to reduce everything to something that's simple.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was kind of getting at, like so many young people, like porn is just so common.
Yeah. Or the norm, right?
It's the norm.
Yeah.
And so, I don't, that it probably is not so related to trauma. It's just a social phenomenon now.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, I think there's more awareness now, and I'm really interested in also thinking about these issues of self-regulation in terms of like culture, the cultural context, like poverty, for example. It's a huge part of addiction, you know, and dysregulation of emotion, oppression in different groups in our culture, and narcissism, the way that our culture is just so unhealthy in so many ways. And it's a culture that really, you know, breeds going to something quickly to process skip. If we lived in a different culture, what would that be like? So in our groups, in our community, what we're really trying to do is, what we are doing is creating a different culture.
Yes.
With different values.
Yes. And a method where people can help each other go deep inside and be with each other in a completely different way.
Yeah. And it crosses age and everything. And we were joking about how, you know, people must wonder what we do, because we have this group of people that range from like 20 to like 75, and we all come together in a community. And it's not what you normally see. I suppose you would see it in, I often think our center is a little bit, I relate it to kind of a yoga practice, right? That there are teachers and there are pupils, and people are connecting together in different ways over different ages and stages of life, and all kind of looking for something that's to do with emotional regulation.
Well, and I think that the focusing process also, it's deeply human. And when we get right down to that level, that we're not so different, and that we can all understand the depths of somebody's suffering, somebody's emotional reactions, It's like we're really not that different
No,
down underneath.
the underneath we're so much more similar.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, is there a story that you'd like to tell about somebody that's gone through your program? Somebody maybe that was shut off initially and
Well, I see maybe a little bit of a conglomerate of folks. I see a number of people actually who fall into this category of um, having ADHD and a lot of addiction struggle, because ADHD is also an attention dysregulation, right? So we're doing a lot of work around that in our clinic, like looking at how attention dysregulation impacts emotion dysregulation and back to the other way. And so it's pretty exciting when, you know, a lot of these people come in and they're usually in their 40s or 50s, and they're working at like jobs that are full of adrenaline and dopamine. And they've got lots of underlying shame and often trauma. Shame that often is carried with ADHD. And then often, you know, then you, as you know, what happens in addictive behaviors is that you end up shaming yourself over and over again in response to your addictive behaviors. So working with that population is incredibly enriching when we get like a more clarity around the ADHD struggle. And then we get more clarity around the behaviors, the process skipping behaviors that the person's using to try to manage those struggles. And then, you know, sometimes like you'll hit under when, as we go deeper in the focusing, you know, a very sad trauma story about, you know, being sexually abused as a little boy. And, you know, that then there's kind of a period of like flooding where we work with the model. I use the model with my clients. They actually take pictures of it on their phone and they use it to orient where they are inside themselves. And so we use that a lot during those times where, you know, you'll hit a really deep trauma place, like especially around sexual abuse. And we have to do a lot of careful work there around, you know, managing and grounding. And then slowly you see over time how people are able to speak about it, about what happened, in a way that they can still stay more grounded. And it's a long process, you know, years, but it's very well. And I mean, we just kind of dance through the process, and there's lots of fun times too. Lots of being together and enjoying each other and getting to know this new person that emerges. That's like, well, what really does have meaning for you in your life if it isn't Coke? You know, what is it? And that part, that kind of reconnecting part. So there's the establishing sobriety, there's the grieving trauma, remembering and mourning, Judy Herman's way of phrasing it. And then this phase of reconnecting and watching how people will do different things. Sometimes they quit their jobs, just leave. They can't do it anymore. They can't be a stockbroker anymore. They can't be a corporate lawyer anymore, whatever it is. And they find something that's much more meaningful to really focus on. And they often bring the same kind of qualities of hyper attending and focusing to that task. But, you know, we joke about that. It's a healthy one. It's a grounding experience. And yeah, so there's a lot of that in the work.
And so you feel with, or your experience with ADD or ADHD is that they have sufficient attention to be able to do the focusing process.
Well, that's one of the beauties of focusing, is that, yes, I do, for sure, because people with ADD also hyper-focus, right? So it's finding that balancing in the middle. It takes time, but absolutely, yeah. And it's so helpful. One of my students is developing a whole kind of program around using focusing and grounding in treating ADD. And Jessica Zorman, she's doing great work with that and finding that it's actually in some ways the most important work to be done in ADD.
Hmm.
The coaching part, the practical part is important for sure, but people do much better with that part of it once they can connect down inside
Mm-hmm.
ground, which makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Makes
Yeah.
intuitive sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then helping people in group to meet each other. So, you know, I'm this person that has ADD and I've achieved a lot of things, but I feel like an idiot. And then you introduce people in the group, they share eventually their story. Incredible sense of healing shame.
Hmm. Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So, do you do any work with families, or what do you think the role of family is in treating addiction?
I think the role of family is absolutely key, because in addiction, you know, it's so much about isolation. And so moving down into that reconnecting place and into the grounded place. And, you know, families are really suffering too. It's
Mhm.
hell. It's hell. It's horrible. So absolutely bringing in the person's support network and working in couples a lot too, because, you know, the partner's going to be pretty fried.
Mhm.
I think it's essential. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really what makes it or breaks it, I think, in a lot of ways for people, whether they can sustain the sobriety is having that connection with community and with your family and your partner and your kids. And so much damage is done along the way that, you know, that's the sad. I mean, sometimes it doesn't, families or the kids are just so angry with their parents. It takes a while to really work that through, but it's hard,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. And do you ever teach families focusing as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Friends and family. Yeah, it's really, I can't help it. I sit with a family member and I see them, you know, I see that they're like, there's all this going on in here. And so, yeah, I gently will point that out, you know, boy, it looks like something's really intense in there.
Mm.
And, you know, sometimes people will look at me like I'm crazy, so I let it go. But other times, often, you know, people will like, yeah, what's going on in there? And then you're in.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then we can start to ask other family members, well, what's going on for you? You see this in your mom? What's happening for you in your body? And it's
Mm.
amazing.
Mm. People can just go there.
You can go there. Not everybody. Some people are terrified. And so you have to be very, very careful. But you just back up. Right?
Mhm.
But when people can connect in that bodily way, relating to each other through that felt sense in a body way, that's where it's at.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, like as you said, getting out of the mind and out of thought and thinking and
Yeah.
into the body, and I suppose mirror neurons start to
Yeah.
function, and people get more empathy toward each other and
Exactly.
more understanding, and
Yeah.
maybe get out of that blame game and that vicious cycle of family dynamics.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Then you kind of use that you have, instead of the group that's focusing together, you have the family members that are focusing together, and that's even probably more powerful for the person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm. So, how long are people in your program? What's the exit strategy, or relapse prevention strategy?
We don't have we don't have an exit strategy, because what happens is people come in, and then after a while they see me, usually in the beginning, or somebody else who's working with people, and then we often invite them into the groups. So once they're in the groups, they can take classes and courses, or they can do a focusing oriented therapy group. They become part of our community. Now, some people leave, but everybody is always welcome to stay forever. So
Mm.
as long as we exist and become a trainer, some people go on and they become focusing trainers, um, or focusing oriented therapists.
Mhm.
So that's the beauty of community, right? So
Yeah,
you don't have to leave. You can stay and you can build. We can build something together.
you're building deep community based on deep sharing and seeing of each other. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, is there anything else that you'd like people to know? I'll ask you in a minute how people can contact you, but what did we leave out?
I guess I feel a sense of urgency around organizing. Um, there are people that are doing good work in terms of thinking about alternative models for addiction. Mark Lewis, and I think, Vander Kolk has some, he kind of, I think he gets that part around emotion regulation. And Michael Walker, I just met recently. He wrote a great book called The Social Construction of Mental Illness and its implications for neuroplasticity. So he's looking again at like just alternative models, that we need to move away from pathologizing. Desperately need to move away from pathologizing. It's like overtime.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad that you've done this, and I really think the next piece is to get together physically.
Yeah, a conference, as you mentioned.
Conference, yeah, absolutely. Together, and to invite people and to be together and really start to shake things up. Shake things up and get all these new ways of working, get them under a new umbrella, like you're doing here, but to translate that into action. Action step. So what are we going to do? Who's going to write it up? How are we going to do it together? And with the internet, it's so great because we can all have our little things we're doing and connect with each other, and then lead people into, oh, you're in California, so-and-so's here, so-and-so's here.
Maybe we have a new organization forming.
Yeah.
We do.
I'm in.
Yeah, we've curated quite a collection of people, honestly. They're doing really very interesting things that get very little publicity.
Yeah, so that's what has to happen, right?
Yeah.
We elevate that, and I think the next step is to meet each other.
Beautiful, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll help.
All right, Jan, beautiful.
Right? But I think we'd all help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how can people learn more about focusing? How can they reach you?
My website is Focusing on Borden. It's all one word, small case, Borden, focusingonborden.com.
Okay. And how about, is there a focusing organization?
The International Focusing Institute, it's .org.
Okay, so focusing.org?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you want a focusing oriented therapist, there's also an organization for focusing oriented therapists.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for spending this time. Really appreciate it. So interesting. I've been a focusing practitioner for a long time myself, 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
So very excited to hear about you and your work. And it sounds you're doing a beautiful thing.
Thank you.
Go to KillibyCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.